So welcome again, everyone, to this online talk series behind the scenes on empirical approaches to platform governance research. And I'm very happy to host Tarleton Gillespie as our first speaker in this series. And we're going to start with a presentation by Tarleton. Tarleton Gillespie is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research New England. And with that, kind of part of the famous social media collective with other researchers doing fantastic work in that space. He's also affiliated associate professor with Cornell, where he has been working before. Probably, I mean, you all know probably his work on the politics of platforms and platform governance for quite a year. That's particularly why I'm so happy to have you here, Tarleton, because you have been kind of defining and pushing forward that field for quite some years. And so we're looking forward to your input and to have a conversation with you about how to do actually research in that challenging space. Yeah, so I hand it over to you, Tarleton, for your talk.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I will acknowledge, just as a way of starting, that when Christian asked if I would give this, if I would join a speaker series, I think I initially expressed some hesitation. I find myself, I have like an allergic reaction to talking about methods. It may have been spending a lot of time in a department that also valued kind of classical empiricism. And I found that so often people were talking about methods as a way to reassure people that they knew what they knew, rather than kind of think about how messy the process is. I'm a critical qualitative researcher, so to me, talking about methods is admitting how clumsy it is, struggling with its failures, and not ending with a set of instructions about what to do. So I'm going to take on faith that this is a behind-the-scenes conversation and that everyone is sort of equally willing to watch me fumble through things. And I think I gave Christian and Joao and Paloma and the rest of you kind of permission. If you've watched American films about legal dramas, you know that the lawyer can approach the judge and say, can I treat the witness as a hostile witness? And that gives them permission to kind of like ask more pointed questions because you don't think they're actually saying what they're supposed to say. So I give you permission to treat me as a hostile witness because I tend to sort of, I want to open up about these things. So feel free, if you think I'm not, to push a little bit. I do feel a kind of weird responsibility, both because of the kind of unique position I'm in, and I'll address that in a minute, working for Microsoft Research. And I do think, as Christian indicated, like in the last few years, especially, the scholarship that focuses on platform governance, the attention that the industry pays to that scholarship, the attention that policymakers pay to that scholarship, means that these questions about how we know what we know and what kind of access we get, especially for qualitative scholars, it is a conversation that we sort of need to have, even if it's sort of uncomfortable. So I'll try to talk for a little bit, and then I want to stop and let you ask pointed questions. So when I think the place to start is that, and many of you I think will agree with this, is that when we think about platform governance is very much a language game. And when I say language game, I'm not suggesting it's frivolous. I'm suggesting that it is strategic and conducted through discourse. For those of you who recognize the phrase, I'm referencing Wittgenstein, but before you think that I'm getting pretentious, I haven't read Wittgenstein. I've read people writing about Wittgenstein, and it sounds like a great phrase, but I know what he's getting at and what the scholars who use that idea are getting at, which is that language is always an activity, and it's a directed activity. So rather than thinking of language as sort of a reflection of what's going on, you think about it as a place where things are done. And that's certainly true. Anyone who's studied policy recognizes that the work that's done in words is policy in many cases. That's not to suggest that there aren't other things to understand about governance that don't play out in language, but much of what we are thinking about is a language process. And if I was going to go back to my sort of like, graduate teaching mode, I would say there's probably a couple levels we have to think about. So there's the language games that we engage in all the time, the kind of ways that we are setting up a situation in enlisting other people in seeing the problem in the same way, the kind of language games that individuals engage in. We can add to that the kind of like institutional language work. So like how companies and states and organizations present themselves, present the problem, present their intervention, and are not only narrating what they're doing, but also sort of performing legitimacy, seeking authorization, erasing alternatives, positioning their critics as far away as possible. And then another layer, which is sort of like the normative rendering of power through discourse. So the things that don't get spoken about as a way of understanding the power of speaking about some things. So what gets said and what doesn't, what becomes impossible to say, what is erased through the discursive process. And then a kind of, here I'll drop another name, of kind of Foucauldian idea discourse, where the very idea of a profession or a field depends on not only language for things, but language that can no longer say kinds of things, right? So if we're studying platform governance, we are playing with language. We are scholars of language in many ways, or at least that's the approach that I've sort of taken. And probably it's worth saying that critical qualitative research is itself a language activity, right? We are language producers and we are language interpreters, which means that we're implicated in the game, both in the sense that the stakeholders we might study, whether it's social media platforms or regulatory agencies, see us as an audience, right? And so therefore are speaking at us and to us and for the benefit of others through us. That wasn't supposed to rhyme. And that we make language, which means that we are dangerous to them in some ways. Maybe that's glorifying our own power, but that we are also producing something when we produce analyses of what we think is going on. And probably in the most obvious sense, we look a lot like journalists. And so a lot of the opinions that stakeholders have about journalists and the kind of opportunities and risks that they present, we may look like that too, whether we are journalists or not. There have been discussions about, I'll get to that, man. So we often talk about, and this is especially important for those of us who are qualitative researchers who study companies, and probably this applies to people who study regulatory agencies and governing bodies. We often struggle with the question of access. So how do we get to the places where the things that we want to study happen? And one thing that I've found, and I think others in the room probably have found this as well, is that we talk about access like it's a kind of singular act of crossing a threshold, but that may not be the most useful metaphor. That may not actually capture sort of what it is that's happening. We tend to create this sensibility when we use metaphors like black box, right? The company is a black box, the technology is a black box, both imagining that it's hard to know what's happening inside, but also that there's somehow the only thing you could do is somehow get inside, right? And that if you were to get inside, then it would be transparent, it would be obvious, right? But it's not obvious to those who have not crossed this threshold. And it's not clear to me that the idea of a boundary for these places and groups and institutions that we would like to study is the most useful metaphor. When I was talking about this in my recent paper, I quoted John Caldwell, who was a mentor of mine. He studied the television industry, and he talked about contact zones. I don't know if he's pulling that from somewhere else, but he said the contact zones that media industries stage carefully around us as we study them. So there are places that we can meet the people and the decision-making process and the actions taken by institutions, but they are places that have been built in part for us and strategically. So now we're back to the language games, right? We know that we can get things from social media companies. We may be frustrated that we can't get more, but there are places where we can encounter people, actions, and the claims they make around those actions. But Caldwell's point is that those contact zones are built in anticipation of us arriving, or people like us, maybe journalists. and they are points of access that are themselves sort of language spaces, right? Where certain things will be said and other things will be kept from us. Topics will be framed carefully with particular interests in mind. And part of the discovery is that taking this role, so working at Microsoft Research, I may have presumed, and certainly people who hear about my role presume, that I've crossed the threshold, right? That for those who are, based at universities or nonprofits or sort of think tanks and wish they could get access to what the hell Microsoft does or Twitter does or TikTok does, might imagine that because I'm employed by Microsoft that I've somehow crossed that threshold. And what's funny is that my position doesn't in any way solve that challenge. It doesn't put me inside of a box. It doesn't cross me across a line. It may put me into different contact zones, but it doesn't sort of, it doesn't cross a line in some sort of like magical sense. The boundary of a company is a very powerful contact zone, or it's a place where contact zones get staged because it's a site that can be policed, right? It's a place where physical access can be governed and sort of legal terms of access can be established, but it's not the only place where contact zones exist. Some contact zones exist outside of the company, and some contact zones exist within the company. So as a sort of like revelation and side project, I'm based in the Boston, Cambridge area. I'm part of Microsoft Research. Obviously, Microsoft corporate headquarters is on the West Coast in Redmond. And our lab was put here in particular reasons to be like an academic exercise. It was supposed to sit next to MIT and Harvard, and that sort of proves its value. Or it gives us access to people who are smart and live in those places. The idea of being able to sort of walk into a product group's office and team and say, I really want to understand what you're doing, is both more possible than ever before, but not particularly easy. And the kind of distinction that product teams have between what they do and what Microsoft Research does, and then the additional distance that not being at Redmond, but being, all across the US, means that there's still bridging processes. There's still ways that those companies are staging themselves, those product teams are staging themselves. There's still reasons for them to say, I don't think I need to talk to you. And for example, you may have heard that Microsoft has made a big investment in AI. If you didn't, I'm sure it was small news. But for several months, we heard that there was a tented project, which I love because of course the tent has like a metaphor of like a boundary, right? But a canvas boundary, like it's not like a fortress or something. There was a tented project that the rest of us sort of wouldn't know about. And that was both told to us as something that we were supposed to be intrigued by, that something good was happening, and told that we would have no access to it. There were people in Microsoft Research who apparently were sort of allowed into the tent. I have no idea what that process looked like, right? I don't know if they were approached individually and said like, you're inside the tent, or here's the password or whatever. But it meant that inside the company, there was a very distinct effort to sort of draw these distinctions. And there were very limited contact zones, right? The ability to call up a product team and say, like, I'm curious what it means to have a large language model and what you're doing with it would have been much more difficult. And our sort of discovery of those tools came when everyone else discovered them, right? When they were announced to the public. So there are points of contact, both internal and external. And the idea of contact zone, again, is like not that it's another line to be drawn, but it's a space with specific terms about how you get to speak to people and how much is going to be revealed and under what conditions. And it's worth pointing out that when we fight about questions like transparency, when we imagine policy efforts to regulate transparency, it is beholden to us to remember that even those disclosures are themselves language games, and transparency reports and transparency practices are themselves contact zones, right? What are the terms to which a stakeholder comes to that zone? What aspirations do they have about what they can get out of being upfront, withholding other kinds of information? What other stakeholders come to that space, whether it's the regulator or the researcher or the public or the press? What can they expect to be able to ask and have answered, and what can't they? So I want to tell you just sort of a quick story. I discussed this a little bit in the paper that Christian circulated, called Do Not Recommend. If you don't have a copy of it, I didn't realize that now if you go into Google and type in Do Not Recommend Tarleton Gillespie, you'll get my paper. So do that. That's strange. And the paper is about how a number of social media companies, I would say most social media companies, have been experimenting for several years now with a content moderation approach that doesn't focus on removing content, but focuses on reducing its circulation. And people who study content moderation, this is going to be not surprising. We've heard critiques about shadow banning, about sort of attempts to kind of use the recommendation algorithm to sort of make things disappear. And I was hearing about those, but also finding that most of the work that was trying to identify what was going on was depending on anecdotal user reports. And I don't mean anecdotal as dismissive. It just means like users were not in a great position to know exactly what was happening, right? They suspected things were happening. They could point to, this video didn't seem to circulate. This video didn't seem to earn like my other ones do, right? But the very point of the process was, I thought, to render the intervention hard to pinpoint. So it then becomes a problem if what you're going to lean on is the users who have been left in a position to not know, right? And in a position where to suspect and accuse had its own political value, right? To say, look, they're shutting us down, and whoever the they is, whether that's sex workers or minority communities or outspoken conservatives or whatever, there was value in saying it was happening, and there was little way to prove that it was happening. That was sort of the point. And I found this interesting and frustrating, but I wasn't intending to write about it. And then I got contacted by someone at a platform. I won't specify where. It was not internal to Microsoft. It was a separate company, who was interested in involving academics more in the process of their own policymaking. And I said that vaguely because I think that what they wanted was unclear. They like invited people to a kind of like brainstorming session. There were about 12 academics who came. I only know one or two of them because many of them were data scientific, right? They were like really interesting work. I don't mean that dismissively, like psychologists who were interested in the impact on some community, right? And really wish that they could have greater access to this platform's, recommendation system and content. And this person who had sort of called this together was on board with the idea that their company should be more open to academics of various disciplines, and was trying to sort of, it's hard to tell, was trying to get academics who could demonstrate to their superiors that having that relationship, being a bit more open about access to content and access to algorithmic output would be beneficial to both parties. I think I was a little different because I was a qualitative researcher, and I was like, I want to sit in the room where the policymakers are talking about, is this working and what is it doing, and having these debates that I imagine were happening. And this person was interested. Like I got response from this person, and I sat in a couple meetings and then like continued a conversation with them, trying to find out sort of like when this process started, who I could talk to. And I highlight in the paper that this arrangement came with a couple of kind of weird dynamics. And I'm trying to be kind of like self-critical about my own position, right? I know that like not everybody is in the position that I am. One of the things I found was that I think that the fact that I work for a tech company granted me some kind of access or legitimacy, that they felt like they knew that I published out. They knew they'd seen my work. They knew that I worked for a competitor. I mean, you could argue, depending on sort of how you see the specifics or range of competition. But that it seemed like there was sort of, and they were inviting other people who were university based. but there was a kind of like understanding of the partnership value of that practice. And I know this person was imagining that they would be able to create some kinds of official arrangements that would grant data access. It's worth also saying that many of the big US-based companies were seeing European policy approaching, and I think were telling themselves, or at least people in the company were telling their superiors, we're going to have to end up doing this anyway, right? So let's get ready and do it on our own terms rather than sort of having to figure it out after a large piece of European legislation says you must grant certain kinds of access. So this is both like a preparatory action, but I also think someone inside the company wanting there to be more of this and trying to figure out how to gain legitimacy for their own internal conversations about how to do that. But I also think that the reason that person was willing to talk to me more, we had a number of one-on-one conversations, and they put me in touch with other people inside of the kind of trust and safety group that was doing what I ended up calling reduction, that we would call shadow banning, like manipulating the algorithm so as to limit the circulation of content that they thought was problematic, but not worth removing, was a kind of like using me as a consultant by the very fact that I was asking kind of questions that they weren't used to hearing. And I was benefiting from that because they were giving me some more information about what they do than was strictly available in the kind of like published blog, corporate blog policy space. And I thought it was interesting because it wasn't like the kind of access I even have through Microsoft. So it was like I looked comfortable, and I think it had something to do with the fact that I have a tech company named after me. I think it had something to do with the fact that like they knew I asked these questions, and they had seen me at like academic industry conferences, so like a sort of known quantity inside of a conversation, which is a different kind of access because there are certainly like probably people in the room with you, Christian, who are asking really great questions. But because they haven't already kind of like played the game yet, they don't have an access that I do, not because of Microsoft, but because of like previous publications and, whatever. It also meant that I was getting information that I didn't sign an NDA to protect, but I also hadn't officially said this is a research exercise. So I was treading some questionable lines about what we would call IRB, or sort of like subject protection of researchers. And there were a couple moments, there was one moment with this person and their colleague where I was going to have a conversation with them and this colleague, and I thought, really, like, this guy is sort of like being interviewed, like he's my data, the second guy, right? So I really have to do kind of like an IRB-esque moment, and Microsoft Research has an IRB process that I'm glad we have. So I sort of said like, hey, I'm going to send you, and I wrote the version that is like the most non-scary, non-threatening, like, where this conversation, I protect this thing, all sort of like in the kind of informal language. But Microsoft has this terrible, totally legal document that was written by like not ethics researchers, but by like compliance people that I have to attach to this thing that like I wouldn't want to sign it. Like, it's terrifying. It feels like every little corner is sort of legally guarded against. But I sent this thing along, and they all of a sudden got really, really nervous. They were like, "Oh, we'd have to run this. We can't. I'm sorry. I'm not sure there's whatever." I could hear all the backing off. And so I said, "Forget it. I won't consider this an interview. We'll do this on background." Now I'm using journalist language, right? We'll do this on background. I won't quote from any of the interviews. And they relaxed, and we had a conversation. Now, one interpretation of that is that I just decided not to do institutional ethics. That's possible. I stand by that as a possibility. What I decided to do, and what I say in the paper, is that I was very careful to only report things in the paper that I could independently verify with published material. Like, if I learned something in those conversations, I then went to see if I could find something that showed me that that was what was happening at this company or at the company being described or whatever. If I couldn't do it, then I didn't include it in the paper. And I swear, I had a really complicated system where like I had color coded things I knew. And if I found a thing that was like, okay, good, they acknowledge it here, then I changed the color, and then I could like only write from things that were in orange, but not the things that were in red. And, you know, I was trying to sort of like create a line for myself, but you may think that that's self, I don't know, whatever. There's a critique of that for sure. But it also seemed like I had entered a contact zone, to use Caldwell's language, where because I was seen as inside the conversation, and again, not inside the company, which I imagined when I signed on with Microsoft that I was going to make it very difficult for me to talk to any other company, right? Because there'd be this kind of like competitor frame. And what I found was it didn't gain me much access to Microsoft, but it gave me more access to other companies, which is really strange. So all that is to say, and I want to stop in about 2 minutes so we have plenty of time for conversation, is that there were definitely things that I heard in that conversation. There was even a moment where there was like actually a slip. You don't think this is actually going to happen, but the person like misspoke and corrected themselves. And I asked my main contact person, like, can you confirm like what that person said that they then corrected? And they said no. But I went looking for what I thought I heard. And it opened up a lot of insights into what I thought was happening. I hate that story because it's not a thing that I can hand to anybody, right? Like a really high quality grad student who's in this field is not going to get to do what I just did. The scholars in the room are in their own positions, so may have different kinds of contact zones that they can establish, but they're weirdly specific, right? They're specific to what they've done before. They're specific to their institutional home. They're specific to very, particular in social relationships that have been built. And that's not like replicable. I don't mean like in an empirical sense, but it's hard to hand that to other scholars who should have the same kind of access, like in principle. But I tell it anyway, because that was the sort of weird pathway that I was able to learn some things that then mostly were public. Like I'm citing blog posts and I'm citing documents that were shared. They're just hard to find. And I think the reason why I titled the talk like things platforms kind of don't want to talk about is that there is a kind of like public voice. Again, it's performed, that you can find in corporate blogs and you can find in statements that, CEOs make in TED Talks and, sort of garbage scenarios like that, but will be said and are insightful and can be used as evidence. Again, not evidence of what is, but evidence as to what game is being played, right? And I think that's the part I always come back to. It's like being aware that if it's not about access reveals true, but it's that contact zones reveal different language games. And there are things that can be learned from the different language games that we play. I said I wouldn't end with advice, but I do think that one thing we can do in this field is we can study language games, and we can just be really diligent about finding all the language, right? Like there's many places where these stakeholders speak. There are different kinds of contact zones besides the kind of frontal assault. If you call and say, I want to interview somebody, you'll get the PR handling. That for many of these companies is very, especially the big ones, very careful right now, very nervous right now. That wasn't always true, but it's certainly true now. But there are other places like technical conferences and policy conferences where people come, and yes, they are being very careful about what they say. They are representing their company or saying, now, please don't take these comments as representing the company, but they're also in their professional milieu. And so they do sound different. And you can approach them as a professional colleague as opposed to an interrogator, right? Some people in our field pursue parts of the company that aren't the company. So people who are like labor scholars and are finding all sorts of weird third-party labor communities that are working for platforms but don't work at platforms. And then we can take advantage of any available institutional power, right? So as we build relationships to policymakers, that gives us different kind of standing with company stakeholders, right? And that's hard and it takes time and it falls apart when people change roles, but that it is certainly possible. But again, the last reminder is like, none of these are genuine points of access. They are different contact zones with different language games. And that has to be front and center, because it's really easy. Part of the game of opening up a contact zone is saying, I will give you privileged access. And the hope is that you will believe what is being said as if it's genuine because you were granted special access. But that is a technique of managing you and the context zone, right? So even access isn't access, but there are lots and lots of ways to find contact zones that are illuminating. I hope you have questions. I'll stop there. Friendly or hostile, I'll take them both.